I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, as I present this installment of literature review, which is just before I make a presentation of the actual structure, which will be a lecture on a suggested structure, not actually hard and fast rules on how you craft your literature review. It will be just, suggestion on how you can come up with literature review. In this video, I want to present to you points to note on the structure and the style of writing literature review. We are going to the practical aspects of literature review. What we covered in previous videos were introductory elements and other conceptual issues or theoretical issues, as it were, to take into account when coming up with the literature review. But in this installment, we are looking at the practical aspects of actually producing a literature review, because we are zeroing in on structure and style, the writing style, which one has to adopt when they are conducting literature review. And there are quite a number of parts that we are going to take into account in this presentation. I will present the parts as we move. There are basically 5 or so parts that we need to take into account when we look at the structure and the writing style or styles that one has to adopt in order to come up with, an acceptable literature review, a good literature review chapter. One thing which we have to note is that the structure of a literature review in most cases must include the following. The first thing which needs to be included in a good literature review is an overview of the subject or issue or research problem or theory under consideration, along with the objectives of the literature review. In most cases, different supervisors would accept different styles of covering the overview of the subject, the issue, the concept, the theory, or the research problem that is under consideration. Some, they accept direct allusion to the subject, issue, or research problem or theory under consideration. Others, they accept a direct allusion to the subject, issue, concept, or theory under consideration, as well as problem under consideration. But the objectives of the literature review, some supervisors may not want them to be stated explicitly. They might want the statement of the objectives of the literature review to be implied in the literature review itself. Whatever approach is adopted by the student or by the researcher depends on the requirements of the journal or on the preferences of the supervisor of the student. The next thing that we must take note of in a good literature review is that the works under review must be divided in terms of the major themes or categories. The major themes or categories. Works that support a particular position must appear on their own, and works that are against a particular position must also appear on their own. Works that offer alternative approaches, completely new approaches to either the works for or the works against a particular approach, they must be also grouped differently. Put in another way, works that support a particular theme must appear on their own with those similarities, and works that are against a particular theme must appear on their own, in their own category. This business of a student just mixing works, just quoting from different journals, works that are contradicting each other, or works where the researchers were researching a particular phenomenon, but looking at different kinds of variables. It produces a bad kind of literature review, which is confusing to the reader, or which appears muddled to the supervisor. The third aspect, when we are looking at the structure of a good literature review, is that an explanation of how each work is similar to and how it varies from the others is needed. The explanation may or may not be explicit. It may be implied in the way in which the student is approaching the literature review, bearing in mind the different types of literature review that I covered. You know, in a critical literature review, the student, you know, adopts that approach, which tends to be very rigorous and might present different kinds of arguments, you know, which enables the students to map out the similarities and the variations between different kinds of literatures. And then the fourth aspect of the structure and the Stein, especially the structure of literature review, is that conclusions as to which pieces are best considered in their argument or are most convincing of their opinions and make the greatest contribution to our understanding of a research problem, they must be adjusted, especially when a student or a researcher is now presenting empirical evidence. The critical evaluation of each work that is reviewed must take into account the following 5 considerations. The first one is provenance. Provenance. When we are looking at the research, is the researcher an authority in a particular area? Even if the researcher is an authority in a particular area, are the arguments of the researcher supported by evidence, or the researcher is merely speculating? Because there are some seasoned researchers who, when they are tackling a certain research problem or a certain conceptual issue, they may choose to just grossly generalize or scratch on the surface. So when we are looking at evidence vis-a-vis the author's arguments, we must evaluate whether the researcher, in terms of this element of provenance, whether the research has adduced primary historical material or has relied on a case study or case studies or narratives or statistics or recent scientific findings in order to validate their arguments or to prove their arguments, so to speak. The other aspect that needs to be considered of each work when we are undertaking a thorough review of literature is the methodology that has been implemented by the research. Because a literature review is normally inadequate if there is no allusion to research methodology. If someone just mentions the research area that was researched by so and so, and they mention the conclusions of so and so or the key findings of so and so, without intimating to us the methodologies that were used to identify, gather, and analyze data, it becomes very difficult for us to link the research problem that was investigated and the key findings and conclusions of that particular scholar or scholars. It's very imperative for us to make sense of the research findings, the key research findings, for us to know the sample size and for us to evaluate whether the sample size was appropriate. Because there are some people who go to town in emphasizing research findings and coming up with research conclusions for a sample size of 15 elements. 15 people out of a population of 150,000 is not representative. Or 30 people out of 20 million people. It may not be representative of the entire population. Certain dynamics, demographic and economic and other dynamics, may not be adequately captured by a small sample which is not representative of the entire population. So the other thing which we need to assess when we are conducting literature review is whether the results were effectively interpreted and reported. So here we look at the discussion of the results. Was the discussion of the results and the interpretation of the results robust, or the interpretation of the results, was that just too generalized and from a layman's perspective? What's the technical rigor of the interpretation of results or the report of results? And then the third aspect of a critical evaluation of each work is objectivity. It is very imperative that each author or research is even-handed and not opinionated or prejudicial. Each researcher must consider contrary data or contrary viewpoints in arriving at their own viewpoint. A researcher who just considers their own opinion to the exclusion of competing or opposite opinions is usually a biased research, or an opinionated research, or a prejudicial research. A balanced researcher would, try by all means to examine the perspectives of other researchers as well. And then the fourth point is that we must look at the persuasiveness of the author's synthesis or thesis. Is the researcher convincing in terms of their arguments? What's the logic behind their reasoning? When we are looking at persuasiveness, it takes into account aspects to do with provenance, methodology, and objectivity. You can't be persuasive when, in terms of provenance, you just jump from arguments to conclusions without, adequate material being presented, without allusion to recent scientific findings of your work, or when your research methodology is inadequate or actually inappropriate, or when you lack objectivity. So persuasiveness flows from the first three. And then the fifth and the last point that needs to be taken into account when structuring literature review, and especially when coming up with a critical evaluation of each work, is value. So when we are looking at this aspect of value, we must examine each author's arguments and conclusions and decide whether they are convincing. Are they persuasive enough for that author to be included in our body of literature that we decide in our estimation that it forms part of the extant literature? In understanding this research problem, does the work ultimately contribute in any significant way to an understanding of the subject, for instance? So this is also critical. So someone might say, I've heard you, Dr. Nzov, explaining to us the structure of literature review, that it should include four things. One, an overview of the subject, issue, concept, theory, or research problem. Two, the division of the works that have been reviewed into themes or categories. Three, an explanation of how each work is similar to or differs from other works. Four, a statement of the conclusions as to which pieces are best considered in their argument, are most convincing of their opinions, and so on. And also these five considerations when we are undertaking a critical evaluation of each work. But I've not really understood how I'm to come up with literature review, how I am to develop my literature review chapter. What are the stages or steps that I must take into account when I'm coming up with my literature review chapter? That is what I'm just about to cover right now, the 4 stages of crafting literature review. The first stage, just like when you are undertaking research, the first stage is to undertake a concise and precise formulation of the research problem. So in other words, it's imperative that the student or the research takes into account, takes seriously and into account problem formulation. The student has to ask himself or herself which topic or field is being examined and what are its component issues. If the student is looking at electronic banking, for instance, are they examining everything in electronic banking? Or they are just examining a component, MasterCards, for instance, and the Visa cards, the international cards. Are they examining electronic banking? In their examination of electronic banking, are they examining the local currency kind of electronic banking or the foreign currency kind of electronic banking? And the motivations that underpin the formulation of the research area. This is very critical because problem formulation helps the student to isolate the issues that are critical in understanding a particular research area or a particular subject. And the problem formulation assists the student to exclude irrelevant or ancillary data or ancillary information to a particular study. Ultimately, a person can relate anything to a particular research problem. But at the end of the day, an astute or a good student, a well-read student, has to undertake good problem formulation by looking at the topic or topics or field which is being examined. And then they look at the critical components that make up that topic. Those critical components later on, they cascade into categories and subcategories, or to put it in another way, they cascade into headings and subheadings. And then the next thing or the next step to undertake is the literature search itself. The student finds materials relevant to the study which is being explored. And the literature search can be either done in a physical library, but nowadays that's no longer necessary. The literature search can be done in online libraries by using Google or by visiting websites of different libraries that exist on the internet. There are some university libraries that are restricted to their own students and some that avail their resources even to researchers in other universities. And then there are certain online databases, like article databases like Elsevier, as well as Spring and so on, where a researcher can easily find material related to a particular topic. And then the third stage is data evaluation or data evaluation. At this stage, the student or the researcher determines which literature makes a significant contribution to the understanding of the topic. It doesn't end there. Once the student has ascertained which literature is critical in understanding a particular concept or issue, the student actually dwells more on that literature in anchoring or in compiling their literature review. And sort of push to the periphery, the literature, which doesn't contribute much to an understanding of a particular research problem or research topic. And then the last stage, or stage 4, it is analysis and interpretation. It's very imperative that before the student concludes the literature review chapter, either the literature review chapter or the conceptual part of literature review or the empirical part of literature review, that they discuss the findings and conclusions of the pertinent literature. So our research, our parting researcher has to consider the following issues before writing the literature review. What are the issues? There are 5 issues that our researcher has to consider when it comes to crafting a good literature review chapter or segment of their study to underpin their study. Number 1, the student or the researcher has to decide how many sources should be included. Literature review, which appears like it will never come to an end, is generally not appetizing for the reader to actually delve into or to read, or it's generally tough to immerse oneself in. So most, readers, they will just skim through the literature and not read everything. They will read the abstract, read maybe the motivation or the conceptual, the chapter where the motivation is presented, which is normally chapter 1. And then they will skip much of the literature review if so many sources exist, which are just duplicating one another, the minor and the major sources of literature. So the student has to decide how many sources they are going to include in their literature review. At master's level, we normally encourage our students to have a minimum of 100 sources cited, either directly or indirectly, within the literature review chapter. Not in the entire project. In the entire project, definitely there will be more. But within the literature review chapter, we expect a student to cite at least 100 sources. So it means multiple sources, they might be quoted at the same time, end of sentence, within brackets. Or within a sentence, a researcher or a student who has classified their literature, they might quote all the authors, maybe 6 or 7 of them, who hold a particular viewpoint, barring any differences, any minor differences that they might be having from each other. So in that way, they are able to satisfy the court. But for undergraduate students, we generally expect them in the literature review chapter to have anywhere between 50 and 70 sources cited within the literature review chapter. Anything less than 50 sources, the research project will be appearing like a diploma level research project. And then the second point in clarifying how literature review should be crafted, that the student must consider what types of sources they have to review. Is it textbooks, journal articles, websites, scholarly versus popular sources? If someone is examining a theory, and then we see them relying on newspapers and online blogs to evaluate a theory, then we've got a very big problem. We'll be having a very big problem. We'll be dealing with a student who doesn't know what they are doing. Because most theories, they are actually developed in textbooks and or journal articles or scholarly work, as opposed to newspaper reports or newspaper stories. But if someone is researching a phenomenon which is contemporary, like, the effects of COVID or on the population in general, on the welfare of people in general, there is extensive reporting on how COVID has affected different communities in different parts of the world. So that information may be available in websites and other popular sources, as opposed to books, journal articles, and so on. Though at a later stage, journal articles, which tend to be scientific and most textbooks which tend to adopt a positivist scientific approach, they might actually include that phenomenon, which was initially covered in a shallower way or in a shallower manner in where different kinds of websites, social media sites, and popular sources like online newspapers and so on, or online news sites. And then the third consideration that the student must take into account, or the researcher must take into account, is that should I summarize, synthesize, or critique sources by discussing a common theme or issue? Or should I just look for the divergence? Or should I examine the convergence between different authors in terms of a summary, synthesis, or critique of different sources? So this is very critical, especially when someone is presenting empirical evidence. It's very important to summarize, synthesize, or critique different kinds of sources that speak to a particular issue. And then the fourth consideration is, should I evaluate the sources? Evaluate the sources on the basis of which parameters? On the basis of their contribution to our understanding of the research problem, number one. Number two, in terms of the persuasiveness of their arguments. Number three, in terms of the validity and the validity and the content value of the research methodologies that were used. And in terms of the validity, when we are looking at rules of logic and also at previous scientific findings of the key research findings of different sources, and also key research conclusions, as well as policy recommendations. So evaluation can take into account those parameters that I just mentioned. And the fifth consideration when crafting literature review is, should I provide subheadings and other background information, such as definitions and or a history? So in most researches that are undertaken by our students in the Department of Banking or in the Faculty of Commerce, we expect novel or technical ideas to be actually defined, even though they may be defined in the existing literature, but we expect the student to give us a working definition of the works concepts and terms that underpin a particular theory. So now we are going to the mechanics of actually writing literature review. The mechanics of actually writing literature review. How do I organize my material in order to come up with a literature review chapter? That's one of the most problematic questions that students have to take into account when crafting their literature review. How should I organize my content in the literature review chapter? So what I'm presenting in this segment of this lecture video is the various means by which you can categorize the literature. You can organize your literature when you are writing a literature review chapter. Number one, you may organize your literature review chapter in terms of a chronology of events. If you're investigating a phenomenon like electronic banking, which clearly at the inception stage, the uptake stage, the diffusion stage, the general use stage, which is like the maturity to adult stage, and if there is a decline stage, or reintroduction stage, or reinvention or reinnovation stage, you tell us about the stages when the cycle is now repeated. So obviously there will be a chronology of events. In Zimbabwe, electronic banking was primarily introduced by CAPS and other financial institutions, but mainly CAPS in 1990, with the introduction of, things like the automated teller machines and so on in the early 1990s. So when we are looking at electronic banking in Zimbabwe, it can be mapped from 1990 to date until we arrive at this point where when we are looking at e-banking, we're also now talking in terms of cryptocurrencies, your PayPal and the host of other, platforms that exist, which combine internet banking and electronic banking prop, where we don't need to rely on brick and mortar structures. Some phenomena might be historical in nature, like when a student is investigating the use of quasi-fiscal activities in an economy like Zimbabwe. They started to be used in the 1980s because in the 1980s, the government of the day was pursuing what it called scientific socialism, which was Marxism, was just socialism. So there was heavy reliance on deficit spending, as well as other Keynesian or neo-Keynesian measures in order to bankroll government programs or government policies. So when you are looking at fiscal, monetary and fiscal policy, as well as trade policy, pricing policy, exchange rate policy, commodity agreements, and so on, all of these have always been influenced by the political ideology of the government of the day. So when you are looking at an investigation of monetary and fiscal policies, you can't avoid a chronology of events or a chronological arrangement of events. Even when you are appraising your literature, you segment it in that manner in terms of which events are actually mentioned and emphasized in the literature. And then the second way in which you can organize your literature review is by publication. And by publication here, it may be by publication chronological, starting from the most recent literature to the most archaic or the most old literature, the most archaic or the oldest literature, so to speak, or starting from the oldest literature to the current literature, the contemporary literature. By publication also, it may also mean publications which exist under the same kind of, say, title or topic or research area. You can categorize literature review in that manner. And then you review all sources that tackle a particular topic or that grapple with a particular topic. And then 3, literature review may be organized thematically. Thematically, here we are referring to conceptual categories. A thematic review or thematic reviews are organized around specific topics or issues rather than a progression of time. So we're not worried about the continuum of time from antiquity to the present or from the past to the present, but rather we are concerned about issues. We are concerned about certain themes that recur, like COVID-19. We are not interested in whether it's Delta COVID-19 or it's Omicron COVID-19 or it's Delta COVID-19 or whatever COVID-19 or the original COVID-19. We are just interested in anything to do with COVID-19. So whether it's the COVID-19 of 2020 or the COVID-19 of 2021, which was primarily Delta, and later on Omicron, which is now prevalent in early 2022. So we'll be just zeroing in on COVID-19, the COVID-19 problem. So all researchers, regardless of whether they are 2020 researchers or 2022 researchers, as long as they are speaking to COVID, they are included under that theme. To give another example, all researchers looking at rural banking, doesn't matter whether they were looking at rural banking in the 1960s or 1970s, if there was such a thing as rural banking, or they are looking at rural banking in 2022, all of them will be categorized under that same theme of rural banking, and so on and so forth. You can give your own examples. The fourth way in which we can organize our literature review is in terms of the methodologies that were used. Clearly, we can't put under the same category or under the same segment literature which adopted a qualitative or phenomenological approach and literature which used a positivist quantitative approach. So literature which adopted a positivist quantitative approach has to be categorized on its own with the models or quantitative statements or postulations associated with that literature. And phenomenological literature has to be on its own because different methodological schemes have got different ways in which they approach the ontological issues, that underpin a particular research problem. So the methodological consideration is one of the ways in which we can actually organize our literature review. And you can actually craft research topics based on, research headings or subheadings of literature review on the basis of the methodologies that were used. Those studies that use the regression analysis or the logit models to understand a certain phenomenon, you put them on their own. Those that used the maybe the VECM, the vector error correction models on their own. Those that adopted the Markov regime switching models on their own. Those that adopted the discriminant analysis or principal components analysis on their own. It looks wrong for a student to just gather in one pot or under one subheading all the literature, all the empirical evidence that was reviewed for a certain problem, but under different methodologies. One author was using principal components analysis. Another author was using regression analysis, specifically the logit and the profit models. Another researcher was using vector error correction models or Markov switching models or the hidden Markov models or machine learning models or artificial neural networks. So the student has to categorize the researches that they are reviewing according to certain common trends or patterns or threads that run through the different articles that the student will be reviewing. And then in actually writing the literature review, the student must take into account how evidence is to be used. Your interpretation of available sources must be backed up with evidence. It's unacceptable for a student to write their personal opinions in literature review. There should be no paragraph, I repeat, there should be no paragraph under the literature review chapter or literature review section of a research paper where evidence, either in terms of authors or evidence in terms of statistics, which are backed by authors or sources, is actually adduced to support a particular opinion. Under the literature review chapter or section of a research paper, it is not the place where a student or a researcher can articulate their own opinions. We don't expect you to be articulating your own opinions before you tell us your research methodologies, how you gathered the data. and how you analyzed the information. If you didn't gather the data, how you analyzed the secondary data. So evidence is very imperative in coming up with literature review. A hodgepodge of statements which are not supported by authors or other researchers in the extant literature is just mere speculation or just mere articulation of subjective views, and it's of no use value to very serious researchers. And then the crafter or the compiler of literature review must be selective. They must choose those sources that highlight important points on a particular issue that they are reviewing. You don't just pick authors that speak in passing or that are peripheral in covering a particular issue. You choose those authors or researchers that actually go in depth in examining a certain phenomenon. Direct quotes, next consideration. Direct quotes, they should not be used extensively. The literature review looks more like a hidden form of plagiarism, where when the whole chapter or a large section of the chapter is just direct quotes. The student must paraphrase what the author is saying. They must summarize. That's the reason why we were learning about how to produce a summary when we were doing ordinary level. Stage, Form 4 and Form 3, Form 3 and Form 4. For those who followed the Cambridge system of education, I don't know what level of matriculation in your secondary education system or high school education system you were at when you were taught how to do a summary. But the reason why they were teaching us how to do a summary, they were teaching us how to paraphrase statements or articles which have been written by others. So extensive quotes must not be used as a substitute for one's own summary and interpretation of the literature, because that's evidence of intellectual laziness. We expect the student to summarize and synthesize their sources within each thematic paragraph. So the topic sentence and the concluding sentence, they must provide a summary and a synthesis of the literature that has been covered, and the summary and the synthesis of the issues that have been tackled, or the concepts that have been tackled. The writer or the compiler of literature review must maintain their own voice. The writer's voice should remain front and center. That does not mean that the writer must personalize the work that they are, or the literature review that they are producing by saying, I believe that so and so's view is more valid than the view of so and so. That's not what we mean. But in terms of their presentation of arguments, their evaluation of which arguments are valid, we must be able to trust the voice of the compiler of literature review, the literature reviews section of a research paper. There are common pitfalls that students especially must avoid in crafting or compiling literature review. Number one, the student must not just cite sources for the sake of citing sources, or allude to sources or allude to authors for the sake of alluding to authors. Only sources, articles, textbooks, researchers or researches, or information that is relevant to a research problem or a research topic must be cited. Not everyone who spoke in passing about a certain research area, but those authors that particularly zero in on a particular research area. So the student must avoid all literature that do not clearly relate to a research problem or a research area. That's the first pitfall that they must avoid. Number two, the student must avoid not taking sufficient time to define and identify concepts in terms of their relevant sources in the literature, and relating those concepts to the research problem. So definitions must be brief. At the same time, they must be adequate, and they must help us to trace the concepts being defined to the research problem, so that the definitions of concepts are not divorced from the research topic that is being covered. In other words, definitions and other explanations of key concepts in your literature review, when you are just introducing it, before you immerse yourself in the conceptual framework, they must speak to the research topic or the research problem which is being investigated. And then the student must avoid relying exclusively on secondary analytical sources rather than primary research studies that tackle a particular phenomenon. Examples of secondary research, secondary analytical sources are journal articles that analyzed what other authors were saying, and then you use them as sources. There you become a third layer. It means there was a primary research who was analyzed by these secondary sources, secondary analytical sources. And then when you are analyzing the secondary analytical sources, you have got no way of ascertaining whether their analysis was biased, or it was balanced, or it was too summative, or it was too elaborate when the findings were precise, concise, and compact. You have got no way of ascertaining that. So as a researcher, you must go deeper to check the primary research studies upon which the secondary analytical sources are actually based. So the pitfall to avoid is to rely extensively on secondary analytical sources. These are the things that we check when we evaluate the literature review chapter, whether the literature review chapter is based on secondary analytical sources or it goes deeper into primary research studies or data. So we will check this especially under the empirical literature review. If the empirical literature review section is shallow, it means the student anchored most of their literature review section on secondary analytical sources, thereby running the risk of misrepresenting the original information which was presented in the relevant primary research studies. The fourth pitfall to avoid in conducting literature review is to uncritically accept another researcher's findings and interpretations as valid, rather than critically examining all pertinent issues, looking at issues such as research design and analysis. And then number 5, the fifth pitfall is the pitfall of not describing the search procedures that were used in identifying the literature to review. So most studies which are not rigorous, they don't articulate how the literature which was reviewed by a particular author was actually searched, the parameters that were used, or the modus operandi that was used to isolate the literature. Why did a particular writer of a particular article isolate certain literature? What motivated them to isolate that literature, excluding other literature? This must be investigated in deciding which literature to include in one's literature review. And the sixth pitfall to avoid, it's reports that isolated statistical results rather than synthesizing them in chi-squared meta-analytical methods. So if someone is just presenting tables and tables of statistical information and there is no statistical analysis in terms of your chi-square testing, your normal distribution testing, your gamma distribution testing, in order for us to be able to evaluate the hypothesis. Such analysis or such reports, they might be of minimal value to, academic research. And then the seventh pitfall that a researcher must avoid is only include research that validates assumptions and does not consider contrary findings and alternative interpretations that are found in the literature. So I believe for today, we have covered enough on crafting literature review. And then in the next video that I'm going to post, I'm going to look at plagiarism, because that's one of the biggest problems that we encounter when we evaluate or read literature review chapters. I'll look at issues to do with plagiarism, and time allowing, I may also look at issues to do with grammar, but issues to do with grammar, I'll cover them in a separate video, because to me, literature review is the heart of the research report. It's the heart of research work. After all, we undertake research in order to add to literature or to clarify literature or to inform literature. So this notion of us extending the boundaries of knowledge by contributing to the literature is what is motivating me to cover the literature review part of research methodology quite extensive. So I will look at the issue of plagiarism in the next video. Thank you so much for watching this video. I believe you benefited. Remember to subscribe to my channel. If you have been watching my videos and you have not yet subscribed, and hit the like button if you like the video, and also comment on the video so that I may know which areas to present on, if you feel that I didn't cover a certain area adequately. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.